Ladies and gentlemen, what you are about to hear was never meant to survive daylight. It was buried on purpose, sealed beneath shame, silence, and the weight of generations who learned too late that blood can remember what people try to forget. And some stories rot because they are old. This one rotted because it was kept alive, and across American history, we like to tell ourselves a comforting lie, that progress corrects mistakes, that time cleanses bloodlines, that science and morality eventually step in and say, "Enough." But tonight, we are not talking about a mistake that faded away. We are talking about a lineage that continued long after it should have ended, long after warning signs screamed from the bodies and minds of its children, long after the land itself seemed to reject what was being born on it. And this was not an accident. This was repetition. And in the quiet hollows of early America, far from polished cities and official records, families learned how to disappear without leaving, not by moving, but by closing in on themselves. Isolation became tradition, familiarity became survival, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, bloodlines folded inward generation after generation until the family tree stopped branching and began collapsing, and no one wrote it down at first. They didn't need to. Everyone knew. Neighbors whispered. Midwives noticed. Preachers avoided names during sermons. Children were born smaller, slower, stranger, eyes that didn't quite track, limbs that twisted wrong, minds that aged too fast or not at all. But the family remained. They always remained, and because to leave would have meant admitting the truth. And these families believed the outside world was poison. Outsiders brought disease, corruption, judgment. Marrying within the blood was framed as purity, as loyalty, as protection against a hostile world that never wanted them anyway. And so cousins married cousins. Uncles chose nieces. Brothers and sisters crossed lines that should never be crossed, and when the children came, they were told this was normal. God's will, fate, heritage, and the children believed them until their bodies betrayed the lie. And medical language didn't exist for what was happening, at least not where these families lived. There were no genetic counselors, no diagnoses, no charts explaining why the same deformities kept reappearing like ghosts. Only patterns, only pain. Only the growing sense that something was deeply wrong and no one was brave enough to stop it. And what makes this bloodline different, what makes it unforgettable, is not that it began. Many did. It's that it never corrected itself, even when the evidence became undeniable, even when schools refused the children, even when hospitals quietly marked files and sent them away, even when state officials considered intervention and then decided it was easier to look elsewhere, and because acknowledging it would have meant admitting failure, not just of one family, but of a nation that promised progress while allowing decay to breed unchecked in its blind spots. And the land remembers these families, old farmhouses with rooms sealed off, cemeteries with clusters of identical surnames, children buried beside siblings who never learned to speak, court records that hint at domestic arrangements without explanation, census data that shows the same names looping back on themselves decade after decade, like history trapped in a fever dream. And yet, they survived, not flourished, survived, clinging to isolation like a shield, even as that isolation poisoned them from the inside out. And the most disturbing part is not the physical consequences, it's the psychology. Children raised without alternatives, love taught in distorted shapes, boundaries erased before they could be understood, abuse normalized until it lost its name. When everyone around you shares your blood, and your blood is the problem, escape becomes almost impossible to imagine, and some tried. A few ran. Those who did often described the same thing, the overwhelming guilt of leaving behind people who were both family and victims, perpetrators and prisoners. Many never spoke publicly. Some changed names. Some disappeared entirely. Silence became the final inheritance. And then the bloodline continued, and even when doctors finally began to understand what inbreeding does to the human body, even when laws existed to prevent it, even when the warning signs were no longer subtle but catastrophic, children born with organs that failed at birth, minds trapped in perpetual childhood, aggression, confusion, despair passed down like heirlooms. And this was not ignorance anymore. This was momentum, and a family trapped inside its own past, repeating itself because stopping would require facing everything they had done to survive. And perhaps worse, everything done to them. And tonight, we begin opening that archive, slowly, carefully, because every layer reveals something darker beneath it. Names that repeat, faces that blur together, decisions made long ago that still echo in flesh and bone. And this is not a story about monsters. It's about what happens when history is allowed to decay unchecked. When secrecy becomes tradition, when survival becomes an excuse, and then we are only at the beginning. And the deeper you go into this bloodline, the harder it becomes to tell where choice ended and inevitability began. Records become fragmented, names blur, ages stop making sense. Children listed as heads of households, women giving birth before their bodies were fully grown, men who never appeared in marriage documents but fathered half the next generation. It reads less like history and more like a system quietly malfunctioning over time, and what emerges first is a pattern of isolation so complete it bordered on self-erasure. These families didn't just live far from towns, they rejected them. Roads ended before reaching their land, mail arrived late or not at all, schools tried and failed to keep the children enrolled. Doctors visited once and never returned. Every outside institution represented scrutiny, and scrutiny was dangerous, and inside the family roles blurred early. Children became caregivers. Older siblings became authority figures long before they understood responsibility. Boundaries that society relies on to function simply never formed. When there is no outside comparison, no reference point for what is normal, abnormality becomes invisible. And then there were the births, and at first they were simply described as frail, small frames, weak lungs, delayed speech. But over decades the descriptions grew harder to soften. Skeletal deformities that made walking painful. Facial similarities so strong it was difficult to distinguish cousins from siblings. Neurological impairments that left adults with the emotional capacity of children. The same conditions repeating again and again, as if the family was trapped in a biological loop, and midwives noticed. They always do. But midwives also survived by silence. They wrote nothing. They spoke carefully. They told themselves it wasn't their place. And by the early 20th century, outside authorities could no longer fully ignore what was happening. County welfare officers documented unusual domestic circumstances. Teachers reported incestuous rumor. Doctors used phrases like congenital decline and familial degeneration, words that sound clinical until you realize they were meant to avoid naming the truth. And the truth was too ugly to face directly, and because naming it would have meant intervention. And intervention meant money, conflict, and responsibility. It was easier to frame the family as backward, primitive, uneducable. Easier to tell the story as personal failure instead of systemic neglect. And so, nothing changed. And within the family, explanations took on a mythic quality. Children were told their ailments were divine tests. That suffering meant they were chosen. That outsiders were weak, corrupted, unclean. Marriage within the blood was framed as loyalty, not pathology. Love became obedience. Silence became survival. And some family members began to understand something was wrong. But understanding is not the same as escape. Leaving required literacy, money, and courage. It required turning your back on everyone you had ever known. For many, especially women, escape meant starvation, violence, or being forcibly returned, and there are court transcripts that hint at this. Young women brought back by male relatives after trying to flee, judges who dismissed claims as family matters, social workers who visited once, then never again, and then the children kept coming. And what makes this bloodline so haunting is not just the physical repetition, it's the emotional inheritance. Trauma passed down without language, fear learned before reason, intimacy tangled with threat, love fused to control. When abuse is normalized across generations, it stops feeling like abuse. It becomes culture, and psychologists would later describe this as learned entrapment. But for those living it, it was simply life, and one man, interviewed decades later under a false name, described realizing the truth at age 14. He noticed that every adult couple around him shared grandparents, that the same last names circled back again and again, that no one talked about marrying someone new. He described the moment not as shock but as dread. Because understanding didn't free him, it trapped him. Once you see the pattern, you also see how hard it is to break. And he left at 17, changed his name, never returned. He said the hardest part wasn't hunger or loneliness, it was the guilt. They didn't know any better, he said, but I did. And knowing made me feel like a traitor, and most never left. And by mid-century, medical advancements made the consequences impossible to ignore. Infant mortality rose, lifespans shortened, hospitals quietly flagged files. Some children were sterilized without consent during routine procedures, part of a broader eugenics movement that pretended to care while actually erasing. And even then, the bloodline continued, and because no one dismantled the system that created it, they treated symptoms, not cause. They hid the evidence instead of confronting it. And this is the part of American history we don't like to acknowledge. That in some places, progress simply chose not to go. That isolation wasn't accidental, it was tolerated. That suffering was observed, documented, and then abandoned. And then beneath it all, the family endured, quietly, painfully, repeating itself because no one showed them how to stop. And the archive grows darker from here. Because what happens next is what occurs when a closed system begins to collapse under its own weight. And as the decades passed, the bloodline began to show signs not just of decline, but of distortion. What had once been hidden in the margins of census records and whispered conversations now manifested openly, visibly in ways that could no longer be softened by euphemism or denial. The family was no longer simply different. It was unraveling, and entire branches of the lineage displayed the same impairments as if stamped from the same flawed mold. Children born with identical facial structures despite living in separate households. Adults with speech patterns frozen in early childhood. Emotional volatility that shifted without warning, laughter collapsing into violence, affection mutating into control. Doctors would later recognize these as consequences of compounded genetic narrowing, but at the time, they were explained away as temperament, as blood, as fate, and inside the family authority calcified. A small number of elders controlled decisions, marriages, movement. These figures were often physically healthier than younger generations, having been born before the most severe genetic damage took hold. Their relative strength gave them power, and power in isolation rarely softens, and marriage was no longer a choice. It was assignment, and girls were promised early, sometimes before adolescence. Boys were told who they would be with, and why it was necessary. The language used was survivalist. Would take care of our own. Outsiders don't understand us. This is how it's always been. Tradition became weaponized. Questioning it was framed as betrayal, and the children who sensed something wrong often blamed themselves. When your body struggles, when learning feels impossible, when anger surges without cause, it is easier to believe you are broken than to imagine the entire system is. Shame became internalized early. Silence followed, and one surviving letter, never sent, found decades later among personal effects, describes a young woman begging a distant relative for help. She writes about fear, about a promised marriage she doesn't want to name, about children born not right and buried without markers. The letter ends abruptly. There is no evidence it was ever mailed. There is no evidence she ever left, and the outside world noticed, but selectively, and journalists occasionally passed through the region, drawn by rumors of a strange family or a forgotten community. Articles were written with a tone of curiosity, sometimes mockery. Faces were photographed. Conditions were described as oddities rather than warnings. The family was turned into spectacle, not helped. Exposure without intervention only deepened the isolation, and after each article, the family retreated further. Roads were blocked. Windows boarded, children pulled from school permanently. Outsiders became threats. The narrative hardened. They were being hunted, judged, exploited, and in some ways they were right. And because the attention never came with rescue, and medical professionals debated intervention behind closed doors, some argued for removal of children, others warned of complications, of accusations of overreach. In the end, hesitation won, again, and meanwhile, the psychological damage intensified. When trauma compounds without interruption, it warps perception itself. Trust dissolves. Paranoia grows. Control tightens. Violence becomes normalized not because it is accepted but because it is expected. And by now, the bloodline had reached a point of no return. Genetic diversity had narrowed so severely that each new generation arrived carrying heavier burdens than the last. Conditions once rare became common. Conditions once manageable became fatal. And still, the cycle continued. And there is a particular horror in systems that cannot imagine alternatives. This family did not continue because they wanted to suffer. They continued because they could not envision a different future. Choice had been replaced by inertia, by fear of the unknown, by the belief that the outside world would only punish them for sins they did not fully understand. And some members began to show signs of awareness, not intellectual understanding, but emotional, a sense that something was deeply, irrevocably wrong. Depression took hold, suicides occurred quietly unreported, deaths were explained as accidents, grief was processed privately, if at all, and what makes this period so unsettling is how close the bloodline came to collapse and how it still survived. And because collapse requires intervention or escape, and neither came in time, and instead, the family adapted. They created new explanations, new rules, new justifications, each layer of rationalization insulating them further from reality. The truth became something dangerous, something that could destroy what little stability remained. And so, it was buried, and this is the moment in the story where we stop asking how it began and start asking why it was allowed to continue. Because by now, ignorance was no longer plausible. Silence was a choice, and then choices once made echo. And what happens next is not just the consequence of inbreeding. It is the consequence of abandonment. By neighbors, by institutions, by a country that preferred distance over responsibility. And the archive is still opening, and what remains inside is heavier than anything we've uncovered so far. And by the time the outside world finally acknowledged the bloodline as more than rumor, the damage was no longer confined to bodies. It had seeped into identity itself. This was no longer a family in the traditional sense. It was a closed, psychological ecosystem governed by fear, loyalty, and inherited silence. And state officials arrived with clipboards and carefully chosen words. They spoke of assessments, of welfare, of protection. But language, when delayed too long, loses its power. The family had heard promises before, promises that led to ridicule, exposure, and retreat. Trust had eroded beyond repair, and some children were removed, briefly, and foster placements failed. The children arrived unable to adapt to structure, overwhelmed by noise, rules, and unfamiliar boundaries. Trauma presented as aggression, withdrawal, or confusion. Caregivers labeled them difficult, unmanageable. They were returned. The system checked its boxes and moved on, and others were never taken at all, and legal thresholds were debated endlessly while children continued to be born into the same conditions. Reports stacked up, files thickened. Each agency assumed another would act. Each delay was framed as caution. In reality, it was avoidance, and inside the family, the removals confirmed their worst fears. Outsiders did not help. They took. They broke bonds. They didn't understand. After each intervention attempt, the walls grew higher. The elders tightened control. Information flow stopped entirely. And this is how closed systems survive scrutiny, by becoming opaque, and the next generation was raised on warnings. Never speak to strangers. Never answer questions. Never reveal family matters. Silence was taught before language. Loyalty was survival, and the psychological effects of this upbringing cannot be overstated. Children learned that love was conditional, that safety depended on obedience. That truth was dangerous. Many developed dissociative behaviors, mentally retreating from environments they could not escape physically. Others mirrored what they saw. Control became a substitute for security, and violence increased. Not because the family was inherently violent, but because trauma without relief seeks expression. Fights escalated. Punishments intensified. Emotional regulation, already compromised by genetic and environmental factors, collapsed further, and then still the bloodline persisted. And this is the part of the story that forces uncomfortable reflection. Because by now the pattern was visible, not just to experts, but to anyone willing to look. And yet, the response remained fragmented, inconsistent, hesitant. And why? And because intervening would have required sustained effort, long-term funding, political will, cultural humility. It would have required acknowledging that neglect can be as destructive as malice, that allowing harm to continue quietly is still a form of participation. And instead, the family was left in a state of suspended decay, neither fully abandoned nor truly supported, just watched. And there are recordings from this period, interviews conducted by researchers under strict anonymity, voices halting, vocabulary limited, answers circling the same phrases. When asked about family relationships, many subjects respond with confusion. That's just how it is. When asked about marriage, the answers are memorized. We take care of our own. And one man, older, visibly shaken, breaks down mid-interview. He says he always felt something was wrong, but no one ever explained what. He describes loving people who hurt him, hurting people he loved. He asks quietly, was it always going to be this way? And that question hangs over the entire archive. And because at this stage, the tragedy is no longer just biological, it is existential. Identity has fused with damage. To remove the harm would mean dismantling the self. And this is why cycles persist, not because people are incapable of change, but because change threatens annihilation. When your entire world is built around survival within dysfunction, imagining a healthier alternative feels like erasure. And so, many chose the known pain over the unknown. And by the late 20th century, the bloodline had become a case study in academic circles. Papers were written, conferences held, ethical debates raged. But the family itself saw none of this. Knowledge accumulated at a distance, while reality remained unchanged on the ground, and progress watched. It did not intervene, and then something shifted, and a generation emerged that had access, however limited, to the outside world. Television, radio, eventually the internet. Fragments of alternative lives seeped in, images of families that did not look like theirs, relationships governed by choice, not assignment, and for the first time, comparison became possible, and comparison is dangerous to closed systems. And what happens when awareness arrives too late? When damage has already shaped every cell, every habit, every belief? And that is where this story is headed next. And awareness did not arrive like a revelation. It crept in quietly, unevenly, through flickering screens and half-heard conversations. A television left on in the corner, a radio station picked up at night, later, a library computer monitored but not fully understood. These fragments were enough to destabilize what generations of isolation had worked to preserve. And for the first time, some members of the bloodline saw families that did not fold inward. They saw strangers marry and build lives without sharing grandparents. They saw children who learned without fear, who spoke freely, who did not flinch at questions. And something inside them began to fracture, and not hope, confusion. And because awareness without support does not liberate, it destabilizes, and young people began to ask questions their elders could not answer. Why do we all look alike? Why do so many of us struggle to learn? Why can't we leave? The answers came back sharp and final. Don't ask. Don't compare. Don't betray. Curiosity was treated as threat. Knowledge became the new enemy. And but once a mind opens even slightly, it does not close easily. And some began to notice patterns too precise to ignore. The same conditions repeating. The same arguments. The same grief. Awareness did not bring clarity. It brought despair. Because understanding the problem did not come with a solution. Escape was still dangerous. Intervention was still unlikely. And confronting elders meant exile. And this is where the psychological toll reached its peak, and depression deepened. Substance abuse appeared quietly, another attempt to numb what could not be changed. Self-harm incidents increased, often misinterpreted as accidents. The family had no language for mental health. Pain was either endured or punished, and yet a few persisted. And a small number of individuals reached out anonymously, emails sent from library computers, calls made and hung up before voices answered. One woman contacted a genetic counseling service under a fake name. When she learned the truth, not rumors, not whispers, but medical explanation, she reportedly cried for hours. Not because she was shocked, but because the pain finally had a shape, and she never returned home. And her disappearance became a warning story, proof that leaving meant erasure. She was spoken of as if she had died. Her name stopped being used. This was the cost of defiance, and still, the idea of alternatives had entered the system. And once introduced, it could not be fully removed. And from the outside, researchers began to notice subtle changes. Marriage ages shifted slightly. Some pairings were delayed. A few unions never occurred. Birth rates declined marginally. These were not reforms. They were fractures, signs that the bloodline was straining under its own awareness. And but damage, once compounded for generations, does not reverse easily. And children were still born carrying the weight of history in their bodies. Medical complications persisted. Lifespans remained shortened. Awareness did not undo biology. It only made the consequences harder to bear. And this is the cruel paradox of late understanding. When knowledge arrives after harm is already embedded, it often feels like punishment rather than rescue. And by this point, the bloodline had become something else entirely. Not just a family, but a warning. A living archive of what happens when secrecy outpaces responsibility. When institutions observe without acting. When intervention is delayed until it becomes ethically complicated instead of morally urgent. And this is where the story turns inward, toward us. And because the most unsettling question is no longer how this happened, it is why it was tolerated. Why stories like this exist not as isolated anomalies, but as patterns repeated across forgotten corners of history. Different names, different places, same silence. And if you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have stayed loyal or risked becoming a stranger to survive? And the archive does not judge the answers, it only records them. And what remains now are the final years, the aftermath. What happens when a bloodline reaches the edge of continuation? When survival itself becomes uncertain? When history finally begins to close its grip? And because endings like beginnings are rarely clean. And by the time the bloodline approached its final decades, it no longer resembled a family trying to survive. It resembled a system exhausted by its own weight. The rules that once held it together had begun to fail. Authority weakened. Elders died without replacements strong enough to maintain control. And with that loss of structure came something far more dangerous than obedience ever was, and chaos. And the younger generation had grown up aware enough to question, but not empowered enough to escape. They knew something was wrong, but not how to fix it. They carried shame they did not choose, guilt they did not earn, and damage they did not cause. And now they were expected to carry the lineage forward anyway, and some refused, and refusal did not always look like rebellion. Sometimes it was quiet, a marriage that never happened, a child that was never born, a person who simply stopped participating and withdrew into silence. These acts may seem small, but within a closed system they were fractures. Each refusal weakened the structure further, and others reacted differently. When identity is built entirely around belonging, the threat of collapse can provoke desperation. Some clung harder to tradition, some doubled down on control. Abuse intensified in pockets where fear replaced certainty. Violence became more erratic, less ritualized, more impulsive. And this is what happens when a system loses its mythology, and the justifications no longer worked. Gods will rang hollow. Tradition felt thin. Survival no longer felt guaranteed. And without belief, all that remained was pain, and medical emergencies increased. The genetic toll had reached a critical threshold. Complications once spread across decades now appeared within single lifetimes. Care requirements grew heavier. Fewer people were capable of providing them. The family became caretakers of one another, locked in cycles of dependence that bred resentment and despair. And outside institutions noticed the decline again, and this time intervention came not as rescue but as containment, emergency responses, temporary housing, disability evaluations. The language had changed, but the approach remained fragmented. No one came to dismantle the system. They came to manage its consequences, and some members were placed in care facilities far from home. Some were hospitalized indefinitely. Some died young, their causes listed clinically, without context. The bloodline did not end with a dramatic event. It thinned, quite one life at a time, and what remains in the records from this period is haunting in its banality. Forms, assessments, checklists. Each document describes an individual problem, never the collective one. Each solution treats a symptom, never the cause, and because by now the cause was history itself, and the land where the family once lived began to empty. Houses collapsed, graves went unvisited, names stopped appearing in local records. To an outsider, it looked like a natural fading, a family line reaching its conclusion. But endings like this are not natural. They are engineered by neglect, and some survivors live on today under different names, scattered, carrying the weight of a story they rarely tell. Many struggle with guilt, not for what they did, but for what they escaped. Others wrestle with anger toward institutions that watched and waited until was almost nothing left to save. And they are not characters in a horror story. They are evidence, and evidence that history does not correct itself automatically. Evidence that silence is not neutral. Evidence that progress, when selective, leaves casualties behind, and this is the final discomfort, because this bloodline was not destroyed by cruelty alone. It was sustained by indifference, by the repeated decision to look away because intervention was inconvenient, complicated, or uncomfortable. And there is a temptation to frame this story as something safely in the past. A closed chapter, a grim curiosity. But that would be another lie. And because families like this did not exist in isolation, they existed in the shadows of society, close enough to be seen, distant enough to be ignored. And wherever that dynamic remains, the conditions for repetition still exist. And the archive does not end with death certificates. It ends with questions left unanswered, with systems that never fully reckoned with their role, with survivors who inherited consequences without ever inheriting responsibility. And this is what happens when blood remembers longer than institutions do. And there is still one layer left to uncover, the meaning of this story, not for them, but for us. And the final layer of this archive is the hardest to face, because it refuses to stay confined to the past. It reaches forward, it asks something of the present, and it does so without raising its voice. And when we look back at this bloodline, there is a temptation to search for villains, to isolate the story into a single family, a single place, a single failure. But that instinct is a defense mechanism. It allows distance, it allows comfort, and comfort is the very thing that allowed this lineage to persist. And the truth is quieter and more unsettling. And this bloodline did not survive because it was hidden. It survived because it was visible enough to be known, but distant enough to be ignored. People saw, they whispered, they documented, they debated, and then they returned to their lives. And neglect does not always look like abandonment. Sometimes it looks like observation without action, like knowledge without responsibility, like empathy that never crosses into inconvenience. And the family internalized this neglect. Over time, they came to believe they were undeserving of help, that suffering was their natural state, that intervention would only make things worse. When a system teaches people that they are beyond saving, survival becomes self-contained, even when it is destructive. And this is the psychological damage that rarely appears in medical journals. The erosion of perceived worth, the inheritance of shame, the belief that pain is permanent and change is betrayal. And what happened to this bloodline forces a larger question about how societies decide who is worth saving, about which suffering is treated as urgent and which is framed as inevitable, about the line between respecting autonomy and abandoning responsibility. And because autonomy requires choice, and choice requires access, education, and alternatives, without those, autonomy becomes a convenient excuse for inaction. And the archive shows us how easily language can be used to justify delay. Complex case, cultural sensitivity, limited resources. Each phrase contains a kernel of truth, and each can be used to postpone accountability indefinitely. And meanwhile, damage compounds, and there is no single moment when this bloodline could have been fixed. That framing is part of the problem. But there were countless moments when harm could have been reduced, when children could have been protected, when education could have been offered without judgment, when intervention could have been paired with dignity instead of spectacle, and those moments passed quietly, one after another. And what remains now is not a family, but a lesson written into bodies, records, and absences. A lesson about what happens when secrecy is allowed to harden into tradition, when trauma is inherited faster than understanding, when institutions measure success by process rather than outcome. And this story belongs to American history not because it is extreme, but because it is possible. Because it happened not in a vacuum, but in plain sight. Because it reflects patterns that repeat wherever isolation meets indifference. And perhaps most disturbingly, it asks us to consider how many similar archives exist, unfinished, unexamined, waiting for someone to care enough to open them. And the bloodline did not end with resolution. It ended with dispersal, with silence, with people carrying fragments of a story they never asked to inherit. Some found healing, some did not. None received closure, and history rarely offers closure. And what it offers is responsibility, passed forward, not backward. Responsibility to recognize patterns before they calcify, to intervene before damage becomes identity, to understand that the cost of inaction is not neutrality, but participation. And the archive closes here, not because everything has been said, but because what remains cannot be documented. It must be acknowledged, and then once acknowledged, it cannot be forgotten. And because blood remembers, but so does history.